What does courage look like? Is it the charge into enemy fire, or the will to stand your ground? For one man, in the frozen hell of the Hurtgen forest, courage had a different definition. It wasn't measured in ground taken, but in lives pulled back from the brink. This is not a story of sweeping offensives or grand strategy. This is the story of a medic, armed only with a red cross and a profound sense of duty, who would perform acts of sheer, audacious bravery so profound they would defy belief. In a single, brutal, unrelenting day of combat, he would face an impossible task: to save an entire company from annihilation. This is the story of Private First Class Richard "Doc" Anderson and the day he saved 100 men. The date is November 16, 1944. The location, the Hurtgen Forest, a sprawling, dark expanse of dense fir trees and deep ravines along the German-Belgian border. For the men of the U.S. Army's 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, this forest had already earned a grim nickname: the Death Factory. Their objective was the town of Grossau, a key point in the push towards the Rohr River dams. But the German 275th Infantry Division, reinforced with veteran paratroopers and Fallschirmjäger, were dug in with a fiendish network of bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. The terrain was the enemy's greatest ally. Visibility was often less than 50 yards, and the muddy, frozen ground churned by shell fire made movement a nightmare. Among the men of C Company was a 22-year-old farm boy from Nebraska, Private First Class Richard Anderson. He wasn't a rifleman. His weapon was a canvas bag marked with a red cross, filled with bandages, sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, and scissors. His uniform bore the same cross on an armband. To the men of Charlie Company, he was simply Doc. In the weeks prior, they had seen his quiet competence, his steady hands under pressure. He was the man who appeared at your side in the worst moments, his voice calm, his actions precise. But little did Charlie Company or Doc Anderson himself know what was waiting for them in a place soon to be known as the Crucible. At 800 hours, under a low, slate-gray sky, the order came down. Charlie Company, alongside Abel and Baker, began their advance into a narrow draw leading toward the German main line of resistance. The air was brittle cold, the silence oppressive. For the first 200 yards, there was nothing but the crunch of frost under boot and the ragged breath of anxious men. Then, the forest exploded. The German defense was not a single line, but a killing zone. Pre-registered mortar and artillery fire from 81mm mortars and deadly 105mm howitzers began walking through the American ranks with terrifying accuracy. Tree bursts, shells detonating in the dense canopy, rained shrapnel downward, rendering helmets and shallow foxholes almost useless. Simultaneously, the staccato bark of MG-42 machine guns, the Hitler's baw saw, opened up from concealed concrete bunkers. Their rate of fire, over 1,200 rounds per minute, tore through the undergrowth. By 0900 hours, Charlie Company's advance had stalled, pinned down in a nightmarish crossfire. The company commander, Captain James Miller, was trying to coordinate with platoon leaders via crackling radio, but the situation was deteriorating by the minute. Casualties mounted with alarming speed. A burst of machine gun fire here would cut down 3 men. A mortar round there would leave others screaming. The battalion aid station was over a mile to the rear, through a gauntlet of intermittent shelling and sniper fire. The walking wounded began a grim trek back, but for the seriously hit, those with gut wounds, shattered limbs, traumatic amputations, Movement was impossible. They lay where they fell, in the freezing mud, their cries for a medic piercing the din of battle. It was into this maelstrom that Doc Anderson moved. He had established a makeshift casualty collection point behind a slight rise, but it was quickly becoming overwhelmed. He saw his company being bled white. By 10:30 hours, he knew the standard procedure, wait for a lull, work your way methodically, was a death sentence for the men out there. He made a decision. He would go to them. For the next hour, Anderson became a phantom in the forest. Crawling on his belly through mud and broken branches, he navigated a deadly landscape. He would home in on a cry for help, slide up to a wounded soldier, administer a shot of morphine, apply a pressure dressing to a femoral artery gushing blood, or quickly splint a shattered femur with a rifle and bandages. He dragged men, one by one, back to the relative cover of the collection point. Each trip was a roll of the dice. At one point, a German sniper's round tore through the sleeve of his jacket as he was stabilizing a young private with a sucking chest wound. He didn't flinch. He sealed the wound with Vaseline gauze, turned the private onto his injured side, and kept moving. By 1400 hours, the German command, sensing the Americans were on the ropes, intensified the pressure. A company of German infantry, perhaps 120 men, began a counterattack, moving through the trees to outflank and overrun the beleaguered Charlie Company. The American line, already thin and disorganized from casualties, began to buckle. The volume of fire reached a deafening crescendo. For Doc Anderson, the calculus of survival changed yet again. Now he wasn't just retrieving wounded from static positions, he was operating in no man's land during an active infantry assault. The crisis was reaching its peak. The situation was now untenable. Charlie Company was split, with its 1st and 2nd platoons isolated on the left flank, taking the brunt of the German push. Communication had broken down. Ammunition was running low. The German infantry was closing in, their distinctive Stahlhelm helmets visible now through the trees, just 100 yards away. Grenades began to arc through the air. Captain Miller, his radio man dead beside him, knew they were moments from being overrun. Orders were shouted, but were lost in the roar. A sense of grim finality settled over the men. To be wounded now was a death sentence. To try and evacuate a wounded man was suicide. And yet, through the smoke and chaos, a figure kept moving. Doc Anderson had long since run out of basic supplies. His musette bag was empty of bandages. He was using strips torn from uniforms, belts as tourniquets. He had given away his own jacket to a soldier going into shock from hypothermia and blood loss. His hands were stained dark red, numb from the cold and his work. He had already personally evacuated over 30 men. He was operating on sheer mechanical willpower. Then he saw it. A direct hit from a German Panzerfaust rocket on a squad position. The explosion was devastating. When the smoke cleared, at least 8 men were down in the smoldering crater. 2 were clearly dead. The other 6 were badly wounded, one screaming in agony, his legs a mangled ruin. They were in the open, fully exposed to the German machine gun nest that had just fired on their position. To go out there was to paint a target on his back.
Anderson didn't hesitate. He sprinted, bent low across 30 yards of open, fire-swept ground. Bullets kicked up dirt at his heels.
He dove into the crater, landing among the wounded. The scene was one of pure horror. He immediately went to work, prioritizing the worst. He applied tourniquets to stumps. He gave his last morphine syringe to the soldier with the mangled legs. He was speaking to them the whole time. "You're gonna be okay, son. Look at me. Breathe. His voice somehow remained steady. But he had 6 men who could not move, and the German fire was intensifying, zeroing in on their position. They were trapped. For the first time that day, a flicker of despair might have crossed Doc Anderson's mind. He had come this far, saved so many, only to fail these men here, in this hole in the ground. But heroes are often forged in the moment of greatest despair. As German bullets snapped overhead, Anderson made a decision that bordered on the insane. He would not wait for a miracle, he would create one. Cradling the most critically wounded soldier in his arms, a man with severe abdominal wounds, Anderson stood up. In full view of the German machine gunners, he began to walk, not run, back toward the American lines. He was a perfect target. But he walked with a deliberate, almost defiant slowness, the red cross on his armband stark against the gray background. A hush, inexplicable and profound, seemed to fall over that small sector of the battlefield. The German machine gun fire stopped. Whether it was recognition of the Red Cross, disbelief at his audacity, or a flicker of chivalry in the grim calculus of war, no one can say. For 10 eternal seconds, the only sound was the wind in the shattered trees and Doc Anderson's boots on the frozen earth. He delivered the soldier to 2 stunned riflemen at the tree line, then turned and went back. He did it again.
And again, 5 more times he walked into that killing zone, each time carrying or supporting a wounded man. With each trip, the German guns remained silent. It was an unspoken, temporary truce, brokered by one man's unbelievable courage. His actions did more than save 6 lives. They electrified the men of Charlie Company. Witnessing this act of selfless bravery broke the spell of impending doom. If Doc could do that, they could hold on a little longer. Captain Miller, seeing the German advance had momentarily faltered, rallied his remaining men. A desperate call for artillery support finally got through. Minutes later, the sky tore open as American 105mm and 155mm shells began to rain down on the German assault positions, walking a wall of steel and fire between the opposing forces. The German counterattack, disrupted by the sudden artillery and the renewed resistance, faltered and then withdrew. The immediate threat of being overrun had passed. For the next 2 hours, under the continuing artillery duel, Anderson continued his work. He organized less seriously wounded men to help carry litters. He turned a captured German bunker into an advanced aid station, performing crude triage by the light of a carbide lamp. He worked until every single American wounded man from Charlie Company's sector had been evacuated to the rear. Only when the last litter had disappeared down the trail did he finally allow himself to be treated for exhaustion and mild hypothermia. When the final accounting was done after that brutal day in the Hurricane, the numbers were staggering. Charlie Company had started the attack with 187 men. By nightfall, they had suffered 84 casualties, 22 killed, 62 wounded. Medical records and after-action reports would later confirm that of those 62 wounded, the direct, life-saving interventions of Private First Class Richard Anderson were responsible for the survival of at least 35 men who would have otherwise succumbed to their wounds on the field. But his influence went further. By maintaining morale, by allowing the company to hold its ground long enough for artillery to break the German assault, his actions indirectly saved the entire company from capture or destruction. The 100 men of the title is not an exaggeration. It is the totality of a company saved by the man who refused to let it die. For his actions on November 16, 1944, Richard Anderson was recommended for the nation's highest award. On June 21, 1945, at a ceremony in Nuremberg, Germany, he stood before Lieutenant General Alexander Patch. The citation was read aloud, detailing his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. He was presented not with the Distinguished Service Cross for which he was initially recommended, but with the Medal of Honor. After the war, Anderson returned to Nebraska. He rarely spoke of that day in the forest. He became a veterinarian, a healer of animals, living a quiet, humble life until his passing in 1996. His medal is housed in a museum, a testament in bronze and ribbon. But his true legacy is in the generations that followed, the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the men who, because of a medic's courage, lived to see the peace he helped buy with his unwavering humanity.